So I spent about 25 minutes answering the first question, what do I personally think about Homer? Because it's such an old chestnut, and the range of issues it raises are quite diverse, but it's also quite a fun question to get into, first of all, because it's actually it shows the humorous side, especially with the Lucian passage, of the question of the question, and how the difficulty of answering the question was with itself a kind of amusing kind of satirical topos in classical antiquity already. That's important to recognize, as I said, because it reveals the fundamental importance, cultural significance of Homer, that the Greeks wanted to know this kind of thing and then ridiculed themselves for asking the question in the first place. So that kind of also deals in a sense, in some ways, with the question, why is the Odyssey considered integral to literature? The very question that, you know, Homer and Homeric epic is so important, as is manifested in all subsequent reception, in all later versions, encounters with literary expression in classical antiquity. You can't move without thinking about Homer, pretty much. I think it's not really an exaggeration to say that. But I'm going to explore that question more directly, more specifically, in relation to the question of the characterization of Odysseus in the Odyssey, which is the question from the Leicester Grammar School. You know, dealing with the issue of Homeric heroism a little bit with the Odyssey. But I also first want to tackle this question about how much of an impact would the epics have had on ordinary people's lives? How often were they performed? Well, we've already seen that sense from that Thucydides passage from Book 3 in the history of the Peloponnesian War, that Thucydides himself was already obsessed with Homer and wants to wheel him out as an example of, you know, a piece of evidence that you could use to say, well, this is why people want to reinstitute festivals that have fallen into abeyance. On that evidence alone, and arguments that people have then made also about the earlier traditions of performance of poetry alongside Homer, there's a really strong sense in which the poetic tradition in the archaic period down to the 6th century is itself completely obsessed with Homer and Homeric performance at religious festivals. And there's some evidence to suggest that the instigation of annual properly kind of state-sponsored re-performances of the Iliad and Odyssey were actually instigated in Athens at the end of the 6th century BC as part of the Athenian Panathenaea festival, which was one of the most important annual festivals, religious festivals in the Greek world. I said you can't move in Greek literature without thinking about Homer. That's true from archaic lyric poetry with Stesichorus, for instance, or indeed Ibycus, through to thinking with Aeschylus in Greek tragedy, Sophocles in Greek tragedy, the way Sophocles, especially Euripides too, manipulates and re-articulates and questions Homeric values in democratic contexts through plays like the Antigone, or plays like the Ajax, or indeed the entire Trojan War epic and its bearing on Athenian democracy in something like Aeschylus's Oresteia. So you feel it with Greek theatre. There's no way of separating out, in a sense, the literary from the more broadly cultural or social. It's more difficult to do for the material we have, and there's a good reason for that, which takes me to the next passage that I've put on the slides. After the Lucian passage, we get back to the 5th century BC with Herodotus, and Herodotus in Book 2, when he's encountering the Egyptians and then thinking massively about comparative religion, the differences and similarities between Greek religion and the religions of other peoples. he tells us this he makes this startling and really profound observation about the importance of Homer, and indeed his rough contemporary Hesiod, as it were. I say his again. We're talking about epic traditions, but we're talking about the origins, the beginnings of the archaic period, with Herodotus writing in maybe the 430s, 420s, 410s. Herodotus here says, "It was only, if I may so put it, the day before yesterday that the Greeks came to know the origin and form of the various gods, and whether or not all of them had always existed. For Homer and Hesiod are the poets who composed theogonies and described the gods to the Greeks. Theogonies are the stories about how the gods came to be, the birth stories, which are obviously kind of found in lots of different kinds of religions across the ancient worlds of Egypt and Babylonia and elsewhere, of course. Anyway, the Greeks had their own, and it's Homer and Hesiod who we thank, who Herodotus in the 5th century BC thanks for that. So they described the gods for the Greeks, giving them all their appropriate titles, offices, and powers, and they lived, as I believe, not more than 400 years ago. The poets who are said to have preceded them were, I think, in point of fact, later. This is my personal opinion. So we're interested in personal opinions again. But for the former part of my statement on these matters, I have the authority of the priestesses of Dodona, one of the most important religious sites in the entire Greek world. Dodona, the sanctuary of Zeus with its oracles, gives Herodotus the authority to say, this is what to say about the importance of Homer for Greek religion. So if the priestesses of Dodona have told Herodotus that, it must be right. Well, this is kind of still Herodotus' own view, of course, but what does feel so important about this passage is the integral connection between Homeric poetry and Greek religion. The sense in which narrative poetry, as a cultural heirloom, a tradition that's ongoing and reperformed, especially in religious contexts, gives the Greeks their religious coordinates. They're not only their relations to the gods, but their relations to different gods and the relations between themselves and other peoples. And there's a sense in which on the textual side of things, as opposed to the ritual and performative aspect of Greek religion, Homer is absolutely crucial. You can't move in Greek religion without at some level thinking about how Homer and the ways in which Homeric epic, especially perhaps the Iliad, articulates ideas about the gods and their fundamental difference from men as the basis of everything else that follows for how Greeks begin to think about themselves as human beings in the world, how they make sense of that. And this, by extension, moving on from Greek religion, gets us to answer this question about why the Odyssey matters. Right. So moving on to my next material that I've given you on the slides, moving on to thinking about the Odyssey, and that question, all the questions about the Odyssey, I'm going to kind of roll into one by answering, making a bigger point about how the Odyssey's thinking with Odysseus gets us to think about storytelling and song, but also humanity more generally. So one of the questions asked was, does the characterization of Odysseus in the Odyssey change over the course of the poem? My answer to that question is, change from what? That's the question that the proem, and indeed the early stages of book 1 of the poem, actually ask. The Odyssey's the first word of the entire poem is a man, andra in Greek. So a man is the poem's focus. And that's pretty obvious, right? But the point is that this poem is supposed to be, this poem comes to be about Odysseus and this one special man's quest. But the proem makes it more general. makes it more, gives a sense that the Odyssey is more about kind of providing Odysseus as a kind of example for what men are or might be, what men as masculine and what human beings in general might be or might do, which is a kind of the flip side of the point that Herodotus is making about Greek religion. It's not simply that the Homeric poems tell you about the gods, they get you to understand your place in the world by reference to one another and by reference to these divine superstructures. And what happens in the proem is, you know, pretty strange, right? Because if you know the Iliad poem tells you straight away in the first line, this is a poem about Achilles, right? There's a sense in which the Odyssey is a poem that's more about Odysseus than the Iliad is about Achilles. But the Odyssey doesn't tell you that it's about Odysseus in its first line, because it's more crafty, more cunning, more strange, more difficult in many ways than that. We have to wait until line 21 of the Odyssey to find out that this poem is going to be about the specific man Odysseus, right? As if we didn't know. Of course we know this is a poem about Odysseus, but the proem gets you to understand Odysseus much more subtly as an example of a human being, as an example of a masculine male figure. Right, so that refusal to specify the precise identity creates an immediate sense that the poem is not just about Odysseus himself as the man, but Odysseus as a template for what a man is, for what a man can and cannot be, and for what a man should or should not be. So there's an open texture of the poem, an open texture to the poem beyond the poem that indicates that audiences and readers, alongside Odysseus himself, will be exploring this question. Why that matters and why it makes the question of mapping the changes or growth of Odysseus as a character in the Odyssey problematic is because so much of this questing is kind of self-aware and self-conscious, and self-consciously to do with perspectives and about the nature and limitations of storytelling, the sense in which the poem controls what it wants to tell you, what perspectives it wants to provide you with. So we're always up against a challenge of perspectives with the Odyssey's complex narrative in ways that I think are probably a step further beyond the complexities of, say, the narrative structure of the Iliad. Not simply because the Odyssey does not follow a linear narrative sequence in the way that the Iliad does. Obviously, we hear about Odysseus's struggles in book 1, but we don't actually see him act as a figure until book 5. But even beyond that, the complexity of the texture of this poem and its attitudes towards storytelling and indeed singers is as complex as to render more problematic, but more actually therefore interesting, the question of what do we do with characters in the Odyssey. Okay, so a question about self-definition. That proem is in a sense offering up an empty shell of a character, a kind of a placeholder for questioning and self-definition in ways that the Odyssey fills out, but in various ways that focus the question as much on Odysseus himself as on the ways in which we want to think about human beings through Odysseus's example. Thinking about human beings through Odysseus's example is precisely our issue in the storytelling episodes of books 9 to 12, which Odysseus himself is recounting to an enthralled internal audience of Phaeacians, these kind of utopian people on the at the end of the world that Odysseus meets halfway on his way home. Odysseus's own storytelling comes when he is asked to reveal his identity in Book 9 by the king of the Phaeacians, Alcinous. He's asked for his name and the names of his mother and father, his homeland, his people, and his city, and he's asked of his adventures in a way that recapitulates the poem's own beginning, inviting us to see Odysseus' own account as a further expansion of the poem's main subject. So Odysseus' wanderings pick up in 9 to 12, his storytelling, his own storytelling, pick up the proem's kind of main emphasis, but reinflect and redirect questions about thinking with Odysseus as a character in ways that challenge a straightforward perspective on what Odysseus actually represents, who Odysseus is. How do we actually separate out Odysseus's character from the storytelling that comes with it? That's the narrative kind of ruse that the Odyssey uses to make us more self-aware than we might otherwise be about the stakes of epic storytelling. One of the nice parallels I would probably kind of want to reduce here is to think about how storytelling is a motif in Philip Pullman's novels, how storytelling and the importance of storytelling is itself the focus of much of the kind of drive and purpose integral to many of the kind of cultural questions that Philip Pullman is grappling in with his Lyra novels. I'm going to talk about the Cyclops episode in book 9. Juxtapose it with other bits of Greek, other bits of the Odyssey, to get us thinking about the nature of Odysseus as a character through his own perspective and the perspective of the narrative and other characters in the narrative on him. So one of the things to ask about about Odysseus, about one of the ways of asking useful questions about Odysseus as a hero is through comparison. And one of the most obvious ways to do that is comparing Odysseus's character with the characterization of Polyphemus in book 9. So in book 9, our cultural expectations about giants and monsters may suggest that we're going to meet a monster at its most inhuman. However, Odysseus tells us that Polyphemus isn't really that there's a separation, that there isn't so much of a separation between monster and human being with Polyphemus at all. The Polyphemus Cyclops episode receives a long introduction in book 9 in lines 106 following, where the Cyclopses are a wild and lawless race who have no use for ploughing since they have no crops. And the list of absent features has long been seen as a definition of man in the reverse. So the Cyclopses appear to be defined as the opposites of everything that a civilized man is, and that Odysseus kind of himself is articulating this perspective. That's one thing to say here. But there is an aspect of the Cyclops' lifestyle in the way in which the earth naturally produces the crops for them without them having to do anything, which is utopian and indeed golden age, kind of reminiscent of Hesiod, which makes us think of a kind of idealized form of existence free from toil and grief, as a kind of man's state of grace from which men have fallen into their present state of being in Hesiodic tradition, and perhaps in this part of the Odyssean tradition. So Cyclops' lifestyle actually gets us to think about humans too, through Odysseus himself, because he's narrating this himself. Whether we think the Cyclops is a man or a monster bounces back on Odysseus himself, right? I think this is really important to recognize. In book 9, the Cyclops' gory killing of Odysseus' companions is likened to the behavior of a lion, right? We also know that in this style of epic poetry, lion similes are frequently used to characterize the prowess of warriors on the battlefield. These lion similes are frequent in the Iliad. So there's a sense in which the Cyclops is figured as an Iliadic hero, kind of strangely, perversely. But then we have inflected not just through that kind of Iliadic, all those Iliadic hues, we're thinking about lion similes, but inflected through the Cyclops passage, the description in book 22 of Odysseus, covered in blood and gore after the slaughter of the suitors, as described by Euryclea, with a lion simile, in that passage that I've put on the handout, on the slide. So how different Odysseus appears from the monstrous Cyclops, or indeed from the heroic, as it were, Iliadic heroes of the Iliad, is a question that the Odyssey is asking us. We don't go to the Odyssey and say, right, okay, tell us everything, tell us, poem, everything we need to know about Homeric heroism. The Odyssey gives us lots and lots and lots to think about with Homeric heroism, doesn't give us an answer. Because the Odyssey is interested in asking important questions about us, not just about Odysseus. Because the Odyssey is a poem that is interested in men, human beings, through the prism of thinking with Odysseus and his escapades. That's kind of really, really important. So the Cyclops episode, alongside that passage from Odyssey 22, makes us think about the nature of man in relation to what we might think of as civilized behavior. There's a fundamental ethics, as it were, to the Odyssey's characterization. And that's allowed that question that the poem is making Odysseus in himself kind of enact through his storytelling and his own characterization elsewhere, and the perspectives the poem throws on it, raises really basic questions about Homeric storytelling and how Homeric storytelling enables characterization to resonate. This all, of course, sits very uncomfortably in relation to the fact that Odysseus himself has become the poet of the Cyclops episode. Far more so than with the Iliad, the question of heroic characterization is inextricably and overtly connected with perceptions and receptions of storytelling itself. So as the Euryclea episode in Odyssey 22 shows, the question of the characterization of Odysseus is fundamentally absorbed into questions of perspective or point of view. It's not just, well, that doesn't mean, oh, well, I can think whatever I like about Odysseus because that's my own opinion. But what that means is you have to pay very careful attention to how the Odyssey modulates attitudes and messes with perspectives and reveals its own intricacy as a poem by, and in so doing, kind of enforcing upon you the sense in which poems are incredibly tricky business, but fundamentally essential cultural products. So the Odyssey is the example, Odysseus is the example the poem uses to explore both the nature of humanity and the nature of the stories that humans tell. That is the Odyssey's fundamental double legacy. Why does that make the again, going back to the list of questions, why does that make the Odyssey kind of integral to literature? Because it sets out the coordinates for what Greek literature and classical literature or world literature might be. It asks really penetrating questions about itself, about what literature even is, what storytelling even is, in relation to ethics, morality, the nature of the world, the nature of individuals, individualism, collective identity, the fact that Odysseus is a hero and also a massive failure because he's the only one who gets home. It's a question, but it's also, you know, a huge question about literature. The way it says what it says, the resources it uses to articulate its questioning perspectives about the big questions such as, what are human beings actually like? Right? You want culture to tell you what you are. Right? Human beings are obsessed with themselves, what kinds of people they are, but also what kinds of worlds they live in. That's what the Odyssey does. It uses the figure of Odysseus to explore this. But you have to go to the Odyssey with an open mind about the challenges of the challenges it poses to the expectations you have of having your questions answered. It gives you more suggestions and more opportunities to think about juxtapositions and challenges and upsetting your expectations than you might have initially thought. But that's why the Odyssey is such an important text. We, along with Odysseus himself, are to be the explorers, working to find our own truths about culture and civilization. That is a very roundabout way of me attempting to answer all of your questions. So just to finish off, I've given a kind of a very, very introductory way into thinking about oral poetics, the sense in which you might want to think about how the formulaic nature of Homeric poetry reveals its connections with its oral origins. I've given you a sense of the Greeks' eternal obsession with wanting to know who Homer was. That question is unknowable and unanswerable. We want to sense, quite a lot of scholars want to feel that there was some ultimate mind at work in the transmutation of all that oral stuff into a poem which bears all those oral formulaic hallmarks, but also is more creatively able to extend beyond the shackles of, indeed, if shackles are the right words to use, of an oral formulaic style. There are very clear signs of the sense in which the Iliad and Odyssey are very inventive with the language and diction and structures of phraseology and expression that they use. So they are not entirely bound into a vertical backstory of oral composition. We do still want to feel that we want to have an answer to, how did this poem get set in stone, crystallized in the way that we have it in the text we have it? Beyond its oral origins, we will not ever get the answer to that, but we can find solace in the sense in which the ancients were themselves still always questing at that too. On the culture side of things, I've talked a bit about the sense in which from the archaic period onwards through Greek lyric poetry and then on into Greek drama, there are clear lineages to show you how culturally embedded Homeric poetry is with the worlds in which the Greeks experienced their cultural lives in festivals, in, for instance, symposia. For instance, the Greek symposium is a place where in the archaic and classical periods, poetry is being performed, poetry including presumably excerpts of Homer alongside lyric poems that reuse Homeric material or Homeric phraseology and ideas. And also fundamentally, we've talked a little bit about and given evidence for the fundamental role that the Greeks of the 5th century found in the classical period, found for Homer in Greek religion. In the ongoing traditions that the stories of ongoing traditions it tells about its festival culture, and also the sense in which, from the Herodotus passage, Homer alongside Hesiod are fundamental to the very idea of Greek religion being a thing at all. So I think all of that gives you a sense of the absolutely massive influence that Homer and Homeric poetry has, the very question of Homer and of Homeric poetry has for subsequent literature, subsequent Greek culture and civilization. So many thanks for your questions. Really enjoyable to work with and think around. Great. Thanks a lot. Please ask more.